Welcome to Wild HOA Situations. The HOA wanted control, not safety. I am standing on my front porch in Edmonton, Alberta, holding a boot clamp key in one hand, and Catherine Hall is screaming at me while a tow vendor she called is on speaker. And the boot is already half closed on my wheel. She taps her smartwatch like it is a gavel, her red windbreaker flapping in the wind, and she says, "You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." I moved to this neighborhood 6 months ago because I needed quiet after years of dealing with park visitors and wildfire seasons as a ranger. And the Fairview Property Owners Association sold itself as low-key and professional. I was wrong. The HOA is a predator dressed in policy language, and Catherine Hall is the special assessment coordinator who can invent charges faster than I can dispute them. Right now, I am trying to refinance my house, and any lien threat could wreck the deal. And she knows it. The first sign of trouble was 2 weeks ago when my permit decal for guest parking slipped half an inch crooked on my windshield, and she claimed it was tampered with. She is still talking, her voice cutting through the hum of the neighborhood. "I can fine you daily until you give up," and you cry. The tow vendor on speaker says they can have the truck here in 15 minutes, and I glance at the boot clamp already biting into my tire. I have to leave for work in 40 minutes, and she timed this threat to trap me. I take a breath and say, "The decal is valid. You issued it yourself 3 weeks ago." She rolls her eyes and taps her smartwatch again. The decal is crooked, which violates the tamper-proof clause in Section 12 of the parking addendum. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless, and I do not let my voice rise. I say, "Show me the clause." She smirks and pulls out her phone, scrolling with one finger. She does not show me the screen. She just says, "It is in the addendum you signed when you moved in." I know for a fact I never signed any parking addendum, but I do not argue yet. I just nod and say, "I will need a copy of that document with my signature." Her face tightens. She says, "You will get it when the hearing happens." I say, "What hearing?" She taps her watch again and says, "The one you missed last Thursday." I never received notice of any hearing. She shrugs and says, "We sent it to your listed address." I say, "This is my listed address." She says, "Then you should have checked your mail more carefully." The tow vendor on speaker says, "Ma'am, do you want me to dispatch or not?" Catherine says, "Yes, dispatch now." I step forward and say, "Wait, I need to see the notice you claim you sent." She says, "You can request it through the office, but that takes 5 business days, and your car will be towed in 15 minutes unless you pay the fine and the boot removal fee right now." I say, "How much?" She says, $300 for the tampered decal, $200 for the missed hearing, $150 for the boot, and $50 for the dispatch cancellation if you pay now. $600 total. I do not have $600 in my account right now, because I just paid my refinance appraisal fee. And she knows it. I can see it in her smile. I pull out my phone and say, "I am calling the management company." She laughs and says, "Go ahead, they will tell you the same thing." I dial, and the line rings 4 times before a bored voice answers. I explain the situation in 3 sentences. And the woman on the other end sighs and says, "If the coordinator issued the notice, you have to go through the dispute process, which takes 10 business days." I say, "She is threatening to tow my car in 10 minutes. The woman says, "Then I suggest you pay the fine and dispute it later." I hang up. Catherine is still smiling. She says, "Told you." The tow vendor on speaker says, "Truck is rolling, ETA 12 minutes. I look at the boot clamp on my wheel, then at Catherine, and I say, "Fine. I will pay it. But I want a receipt with every charge itemized. She taps her watch and says, you will get an email. I say, no, I want a physical receipt right now, before the tow truck arrives. She narrows her eyes and says, why? I say, because I am disputing every penny of this, and I want proof of what you claimed. She hesitates, then pulls a small notepad from her pocket and scribbles something. She tears off the page and hands it to me. It says $600, boot removal and fines, and her signature at the bottom. No itemization. I take a photo of it with my phone before she can change her mind. I pull out my credit card, and she says, cash only. I stare at her. I say, you did not mention that. She says, it is policy. I do not have $600 in cash, and the nearest ATM is 10 minutes away, which means I will not make it back before the tow truck arrives. I say, this is a setup. She says, this is compliance. I look at the tow hook chain rattling in the back of the vendor's truck as it pulls into view at the end of the block. A neighbor is standing on their lawn pointing at the chain, phone out, filming. I recognize him, quiet guy named Marcus who lives 3 houses down. He saved screenshots of Catherine's group posts when she went after another resident last month. He is my ally, and he knows it. I wave at him and he nods. Catherine sees the interaction and her smile fades a little. She says, your friend cannot help you. I say, he is not trying to help me, he is just documenting this. She turns to look at Marcus, and I use the moment to text him, send me everything you have on her. He replies immediately, already did, check your email. I open my email on my phone and see a zip file with 20 screenshots. I do not open it yet. I just smile at Catherine and say, I will pay the fine today, but you should know I am filing a formal complaint with the board. She laughs and says, I am the board. The special assessment coordinator reports directly to the president, and the president does not care about your crooked decal. The tow truck stops in front of my driveway, and the driver gets out. He is wearing a reflective vest and carrying a clipboard. He walks over and says, this the vehicle? Catherine says, yes. He looks at me and says, you the owner? I say yes. He says, you got 10 minutes to move it or I hook it. Catherine says, he is not moving it, he is paying the fine. The driver shrugs and says, then I will wait. He leans against the truck and pulls out his phone. I look at Catherine and say, I need to go to the ATM. She says, you have 8 minutes now. I turn and jog to my car, but the boot clamp is locked tight, and I cannot drive it. I look at Catherine and say, how am I supposed to get cash if I cannot drive? She says, that is your problem. Marcus calls out from his lawn, I can drive you. Catherine whips around and says, stay out of this. Marcus ignores her and jogs over. He says, come on, I will take you. I get in his car, and we drive to the ATM 3 blocks away. I pull out $620 because I need the extra 20 for gas later. We drive back, and the tow truck is still there, but now there are 2 more neighbors standing on the sidewalk watching. Catherine sees the growing audience and her face goes red. I hand her the cash and she counts it twice. She says, fine. She pulls out her phone and makes a call. She says, cancel the tow. The driver nods and gets back in his truck. He drives away. Catherine pulls a key from her pocket and unlocks the boot clamp. She says, you are still on notice for the hearing violation. I say, what hearing violation? She says, the one you missed. I say, I never got a notice. She says, that is not my problem. She turns and walks to her car, a silver sedan with a Fairview Property Owners Association sticker on the bumper. She drives off. Marcus stands next to me and says, "She did the same thing to my sister-in-law last year. Claimed she missed a hearing, fined her $400, threatened a lien. My sister-in-law paid it and moved out 2 months later. I say, I am not moving." Marcus says, "Good." He hands me a USB drive. He says that has everything. All the posts, all the messages, all the complaints from the last 18 months. She has been targeting anyone who pushes back on the special assessments. I pocket the drive and say, "Thank you." He says, "Let me know if you need anything else." He walks back to his house. I stand on my porch and look at the empty driveway. The boot clamp left a scrape on my wheel rim. I take a photo of it. I take another photo of the crooked decal on my windshield. I go inside and open my laptop. I plug in the USB drive and start reading. The first file is a spreadsheet. It lists every resident who has been fined in the last year, the reason, the amount, and whether they disputed it. There are 43 names. 39 of them paid without disputing. 4 disputed, and all 4 are marked as pending lien. I recognize 2 of the names. 1 moved out. 1 is still fighting. The second file is a PDF of the board meeting minutes from 6 months ago. I skim through it and find a section labeled Parking Enforcement Policy Revision. The revision was proposed by Catherine Hall, and it passed with a 3-2 vote. The minutes note that the revision was not sent to residents for comment, and 1 board member objected on the grounds that it violated the notice requirements and the bylaws. That objection was overruled. The revision included a clause allowing the special assessment coordinator to impose immediate fines for any parking violation without prior notice. I screenshot the minutes and save them to a folder. The third file is a collection of screenshots from the neighborhood group chat. Catherine posted 16 times in the last 3 months, targeting specific residents by name and accusing them of violations. In one post, she says, "If you cannot follow the rules, you do not belong in this neighborhood." In another, she says, "I will fine you daily until you comply." In a third, she says, "You think this is petty, I think this is my purpose." I screenshot all of them. I spend the next 2 hours going through the rest of the files. By the end, I have a clear picture. Catherine pushed the parking policy through without proper notice, and she has been using it to target anyone who questions the special assessments. She has a tow vendor on speed dial, and she uses the threat of towing to force immediate payment. She never sends the required written notice before imposing fines, and she claims the notice was sent if anyone challenges her. She has cost the HOA tens of thousands in legal fees because 3 residents have sued. And 2 of those lawsuits are still pending. The board president, a man named Roger who owns a contracting business, backs her every time because she brings in revenue through fines. I close the laptop and take a breath. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. And now I have proof. The next morning, I wake up to an email from Catherine. The subject line says final notice, and the body says I have 72 hours to pay an additional $500 for damaging common property during the boot removal. I read it 3 times. I did not damage any common property. The boot clamp left a scrape on my wheel, not on HOA property. I reply and say, "Please provide evidence of the damage you are claiming." She replies within 5 minutes. She says, "The tow vendor reported that you verbally threatened him and caused a delay that resulted in damage to the HOA gate system." I stare at the screen. I never threatened anyone, and I was nowhere near the gate system. I reply and say, "I need to see the tow vendor report and photos of the damage." She does not reply. I forward the email chain to Marcus and say, "She is escalating." He replies, "She always does. Document everything." I print the email and add it to my folder. That afternoon, I go to the office to request copies of the hearing notice and the parking addendum Catherine claimed I signed. The office is a small building near the front gate, and the woman behind the desk is in her 20s, wearing a name tag that says Jessica. I say, I need copies of any notices sent to my address in the last month, and I need a copy of the parking addendum. Jessica types on her computer and says, "I do not see any notices in the system for your address." I say, "Catherine Hall said she sent a hearing notice last week." Jessica frowns and says, "If it was sent, it would be logged here. Let me check the outgoing mail log." She clicks through a few screens and says, "There is no record of a hearing notice to your address." I say, "Can you print that log?" She says, "I am not supposed to, but I can email it to you." I give her my email, and she sends it. She says, "As for the parking addendum, we do not have one on file. The only parking rules are in the main bylaws, and those do not require a signature." I say, "Catherine said I signed an addendum." Jessica shakes her head and says, "She might be referring to the revision she pushed through last year, but that was never sent to residents for signature. It was just added to the bylaws." I say, "Can I get a copy of the bylaws before and after the revision?" She says, "Sure." She prints 2 documents and hands them to me. I thank her and leave. I sit in my car and compare the 2 versions of the bylaws. The original version says parking violations require written notice and a 10-day cure period before any fine can be imposed. The revised version says the special assessment coordinator may impose immediate fines for any violation without prior notice. The revision also says the coordinator may authorize towing or booting at the owner's expense. There is no mention of a hearing process. I take photos of both pages and add them to my folder. I drive home and start drafting a formal complaint to the board. I list every violation Catherine committed, I attach the evidence, and I request a full refund of the $600 plus the cost of the wheel rim repair. I print 3 copies and mail them certified mail to the board president, the management company, and Catherine herself. I keep the tracking numbers. 2 days later, I get a call from an unknown number. I answer, and a man says, "This is Roger, the board president. I understand you filed a complaint about Catherine." I say, "Yes." He says, "I reviewed your complaint, and I have to tell you, Catherine has the authority to enforce parking rules as she sees fit." I say, "She fined me without notice. She claimed I signed a document I never signed. She threatened to tow my car without proper authorization. And she is now claiming I damaged common property with no evidence." Roger sighs and says, "Look, I get it. Catherine can be aggressive, but she brings in revenue, and we need that revenue to cover our budget shortfalls. If I side with you, I have to side with every other resident who complains, and we cannot afford that." I say, "So you are telling me she can do whatever she wants?" He says, "I am telling you that if you want to fight this, you need to take it up with the management company or hire a lawyer. I am not getting involved." He hangs up. I sit there for a minute, then I call the management company. The same board woman answers. I explain the situation again, and she says, "If the board president is backing the coordinator, there is not much we can do. You can request mediation, but that takes 60 days and costs $500. I say, "I already paid $600 in fines for a violation I did not commit." She says, "Then you should have disputed it before paying." I hang up. I text Marcus and say, Board president is backing her. Management company is useless. What do I do? He replies, get a lawyer. I know a guy who handles HOA cases. He sends me a name and number. I call, and a man answers. His name is David, and he says he has handled dozens of HOA disputes in Alberta. I explain the situation, and he says this is textbook abuse of authority. You have a strong case, especially with the lack of notice and the forged signature claim. He says his retainer is $2,000, and he estimates the case will take 3 to 6 months. I do not have $2,000 right now, but I tell him I will think about it. He says, let me know soon, because the longer you wait, the harder it gets. I hang up and stare at the wall. I need to refinance in 3 weeks, and any lien threat will kill the deal. I cannot afford to wait 6 months. That night, I get another email from Catherine. The subject line says immediate action required. The body says I have 24 hours to pay the $500 damage fee, or she will place a lien on my property. She also says I am banned from using guest parking until further notice, which means none of my friends or family can visit. I print the email and add it to my folder. I reply and say, I have received no evidence of any damage, and I am formally requesting a hearing to dispute all charges. She replies immediately and says, your hearing request is denied because you missed the original hearing. I reply and say, I never received notice of the original hearing, and the office confirmed there is no record of it being sent. She does not reply. I forward the entire chain to David the lawyer and say, how fast can you move on this? He replies, if you pay the retainer tomorrow, I can file an injunction by end of week. I check my bank account. I have $1,400 after the $600 I already paid. I reply and say, I need a payment plan. He says, I can do $1,000 up front and $500 in 30 days. I agree. I send him the payment the next morning. David calls me 2 hours later and says, I reviewed everything you sent. This is worse than I thought. Catherine has been running this scheme for over a year, and the board president is complicit. I am filing an injunction to block the lien, and I am also filing a demand letter to the HOA for a full refund and damages. He says, do not communicate with Catherine anymore. Forward any emails to me, and do not respond. If she shows up at your house, do not engage. Just call me. I say, understood. He says, one more thing. Do you have any recordings of your interactions with her? I say no. But my neighbor has been documenting everything. He says, get me copies of everything he has. I text Marcus, and he sends me the zip file again. I forward it to David. The next day, I am at a gas station filling up my car when Catherine pulls in behind me. She gets out and walks over. She says, you really think a lawyer is going to help you? I do not respond. I just keep pumping gas. She steps closer and says, I can fine you daily until you give up and you cry. I finish pumping and hang up the nozzle. I turn to face her and say, I am not talking to you. My lawyer will handle everything. She laughs and says, your lawyer cannot stop me from enforcing the rules. I say, we will see. She pulls out her phone and takes a photo of my license plate. She says, you just parked in a fire lane for 3 seconds while you walked to the pump. That is a $200 fine. I look at the ground. I am not in a fire lane. I am at a gas pump. She says the curb is red. I say this is not HOA property. She says, the HOA has an agreement with this gas station to enforce parking rules. I say, show me the agreement. She says, I do not have to show you anything. I get in my car and drive away. I call David from the road and tell him what happened. He says that is harassment. I am adding it to the complaint. He says, do not go to that gas station anymore. She is trying to provoke you into doing something she can use against you. I say, understood. That evening, I get an email from David. He says the injunction was filed, and the HOA has 7 days to respond. He also says he subpoenaed the tow vendor's records, and we should have them by next week. I feel a small spark of hope. The next morning, I wake up to a notice taped to my front door. It is printed on Fairview Property Owners Association letterhead, and it says I am required to attend a mandatory inspection of my property tomorrow at 10 in the morning. The notice is signed by Catherine. I take a photo and send it to David. He replies, do not let her in. She has no authority to conduct an inspection without board approval and written notice. If she shows up, tell her to leave. If she refuses, call the police. I reply, understood. The next morning at 9:45, Catherine pulls up in front of my house. She gets out with a clipboard, and a man I do not recognize. He is wearing a polo shirt with a logo I cannot read. She walks up to my porch, and I open the door before she can knock. I say, you do not have permission to inspect my property. She smiles and says, this is a mandatory compliance inspection. I say, I spoke to my lawyer, and you do not have the authority to conduct this inspection. She says, your lawyer is wrong. I have the authority under Section 18 of the bylaws. I say, show me Section 18. She holds up her clipboard and says, it is right here. I say, I need a copy. She says, you can request one through the office. I say, then come back when I have seen it. She steps closer and says, if you refuse this inspection, I will fine you $500 for obstruction. I pull out my phone and say I am calling the police. She laughs and says, go ahead. I dial. The dispatcher answers, and I explain that someone is on my property without permission and refusing to leave. The dispatcher says an officer will be there in 10 minutes. Catherine hears this and her smile fades. She says, fine, we will reschedule. She turns and walks back to her car. The man with her follows. They drive away. I cancel the police call and text David. He replies, good. Let me know if she tries again. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos. Later that day, I get a call from Marcus. He says, Catherine posted in the group chat that you threatened her with police and refused a lawful inspection. She is trying to turn the neighborhood against you. I say, can you screenshot the post? He says. Already done. I am also replying to correct the record. I check the group chat on my phone. Catherine's post says, resident at threatened me and my inspector with violence and refused a mandatory compliance inspection. This behavior is unacceptable and will result in further action. Marcus replied, that is not what happened. I was there, and I saw the whole thing. Catherine showed up without notice and the resident asked her to leave. She refused, so he called the police. That is not a threat. That is self-defense. 3 other neighbors liked Marcus's reply. Catherine has not responded yet. I screenshot the exchange and send it to David. That night, I review the spreadsheet Marcus gave me. I noticed that every resident who disputed a fine was eventually hit with a lien threat, and most of them paid to avoid the lien. The ones who did not pay either moved out or are still in mediation. I also noticed that Catherine's fines always come in round numbers, 200, 500, 300, and they always escalate if you push back. I start to see the pattern. She is not enforcing rules. She is running a protection racket. I write up a summary and send it to David. He replies, "This is gold. I am adding it to the filing." He says, "We also got the tow vendor records. Guess what? Catherine called the vendor 6 times in the week before she came after you, and all 6 calls were about your address. She was planning this." I say, "Can we use that?" He says, "Absolutely. It shows premeditation and intent to harass." The next week, I get an email from the management company. The subject line says settlement offer. The body says the HOA is willing to waive the $500 damage fee if I agree to drop the complaint and sign a release. I forward it to David. He replies, "Do not sign anything. This is a trap. They want you to waive your right to sue." I reply, "What do we do?" He says, "We counter. We demand a full refund of the $600, the cost of your wheel rim repair, your legal fees, and a written apology. We also demand that Catherine be removed from her position." I say, "Will they agree?" He says, "Probably not, but it sets the stage for the next step." He sends the counteroffer that afternoon. The management company replies 2 days later and says the HOA rejects the counteroffer. David says, "Good. Now we go to court." He files a lawsuit against the HOA and Catherine personally for harassment, abuse of authority, and breach of fiduciary duty. The filing is public record, and within 24 hours, 3 other residents contact me and say they want to join the lawsuit. David says, "This is turning into a class action. That is good for you, because it spreads the legal costs." I say, "How long will this take?" He says, 6 to 12 months, but the HOA will probably settle once they realize how much this is going to cost them. 2 weeks later, I am leaving for work when I see Catherine standing by the gate at the front of the neighborhood. She is holding a handheld scanner, the kind that reads license plates. She is scanning every car that drives out. I slow down as I approach, and she steps into the road. She says, "Stop." I stop. She scans my plate and says, "Your guest parking ban is still active. Any vehicle registered to your address is prohibited from using guest parking." I say, "I am not using guest parking. I am leaving the neighborhood." She says, "You use the guest lane at the gate." I look at the gate. There are 2 lanes, one marked residents and one marked guests. I was in the resident lane. I say, "I was in the resident lane." She says, "The camera shows you crossed into the guest lane for 2 seconds. That is a violation." I say, "I did not cross into the guest lane." She taps her scanner and says, "The log shows you did. That is another $200 fine." I say, "I am not paying it." She smiles and says, "Then I will add it to your account, and it will accrue interest at 10% per month." I say, "You cannot do that." She says, "Read the bylaws." I drive past her and call David. He says, "She is insane. Do not engage. I am adding this to the complaint." He says, "Also, the gate camera footage is HOA property, and we can subpoena it. If she is lying, we will prove it." That afternoon, I get a notification that my refinance application is on hold. The lender says there is a pending lien on my property and they cannot proceed until it is resolved. I call David in a panic. He says, "Do not worry. The injunction is still in place, so they cannot actually file the lien. But they reported it to the credit agencies anyway, which is illegal. I am filing a motion to hold them in contempt." He says, "This is going to cost them a lot of money." I say, "How much?" He says, "Tens of thousands, maybe more." The judge is not going to be happy. I hang up and sit on my porch. The boot clamp scrape on my wheel catches the light. I take another photo. I have been documenting everything, and the folder on my laptop is over 200 files now. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless, and now I have a certified mail trail proving they received my compliance proof and fined me anyway. The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. David says it will be in front of a judge, not the HOA board, because we are bypassing the internal dispute process. He says, bring everything. All your documents, all your photos, all your emails. We are going to bury them. I spend the next 2 weeks organizing my evidence. I print every email, every screenshot, every page of the bylaws. I make 3 binders, one for me, one for David, and one for the judge. Marcus helps me label everything. He also gives me a flash drive with video clips from his doorbell camera showing Catherine's visits to my house. One clip shows her taping the inspection notice to my door at 6 in the morning. Another shows her standing on my porch for 10 minutes, looking through my front window. David says, that is trespassing. We are adding it. The day before the hearing, I get a call from Roger, the board president. He says, look, I know things got out of hand. Catherine can be a little overzealous. What if we settle this quietly? I will waive all the fines. And you drop the lawsuit. I say, what about the lien report? He says, I will make sure it gets removed from your credit file. I say, what about Catherine? He says, she stays. She is good at what she does, and the board supports her. I say, then we have nothing to talk about. He says, you are making a mistake. This is going to cost you more than it costs us. I say, we will see. I hang up. I text David and tell him about the call. He says, they are scared. That is a good sign. Stick to the plan. The hearing is in a downtown courthouse. I arrive early with David and Marcus. We sit in the hallway outside the courtroom, and I see Catherine walk in with Roger and a woman I do not recognize. The woman is wearing a suit, and David whispers that is their lawyer. We go inside, and the judge, a man in his 60s with silver hair, asks everyone to take their seats. David stands and says, Your Honor, this case is about a homeowners association that weaponized its parking enforcement rules to target and harass my client. We have documented over 20 violations of the HOA's own bylaws, as well as evidence of fraud, trespassing, and illegal lien reporting. The judge nods and says, Proceed. David hands me a stack of documents, and I pass them to the bailiff, who gives them to the judge. David walks through the timeline, starting with the crooked decal and ending with the lien report. He shows the emails, the tow vendor records, the board meeting minutes, and the video clips. He plays the audio from the gas station confrontation, where Catherine threatened me with daily fines. The judge listens without interrupting. When David finishes, he says, Your Honor, my client stayed polite because polite makes bullies careless, and as a result we have a certified mail trail proving the HOA received his compliance proof and fined him anyway. The judge turns to Catherine's lawyer and says, Your response? The lawyer stands and says, Your Honor, the HOA has the authority to enforce its rules as it sees fit. The plaintiff signed the bylaws when he purchased his property, and he is bound by them. The fines were imposed in accordance with the parking enforcement policy, and the lien report was a clerical error that has since been corrected. The judge says, What about the lack of notice? The lawyer says, The HOA sent notice to the plaintiff's address, and if he did not receive it, that is not the HOA's fault. David stands and says, Your Honor, We have testimony from the HOA office manager stating that no notice was ever sent. We also have the outgoing mail log, which confirms there is no record of any notice. The judge looks at Catherine's lawyer and says, "Do you have any evidence that notice was sent?" The lawyer hesitates and says, "We are working on obtaining that evidence." The judge says, in other words, no. He flips through the documents in front of him and says, "I have seen enough." He looks at Catherine and says, "Miss Hall, did you or did you not send written notice to the plaintiff before imposing the first fine?" Catherine stands and says, "I sent notice verbally when I saw him in person." The judge says, "That is not written notice. Did you send anything in writing?" Catherine says, "I sent an email." The judge says, "When?" Catherine says, "I do not remember the exact date." The judge says, "Sit down." The judge looks at both lawyers and says, "I am going to make this very simple. The HOA violated its own bylaws by imposing fines without written notice. The HOA violated state law by reporting a lien that was subject to an active injunction. And Miss Hall personally engaged in harassment and trespassing. I am ordering the HOA to refund the plaintiff all fines paid, to cover his legal fees, and to remove Miss Hall from any position of authority within the association. I am also ordering the HOA to send written notice to all residents explaining the correct parking enforcement process, and to halt all enforcement actions for 90 days pending a full audit of Miss Hall's conduct. If the HOA fails to comply, I will hold the board president and Miss Hall in contempt. Do you understand?" Catherine's lawyer says, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge says, "Good." This hearing is adjourned. He bangs the gavel, and everyone stands. Catherine stares at me, her face pale. Roger looks like he wants to say something, but his lawyer puts a hand on his arm and shakes her head. They leave without a word. Marcus claps me on the shoulder and says, "You did it." David says, "We did it." He says the HOA has 30 days to comply. If they do not, we go back to court, and the penalties get worse. I nod and take a breath. It is over. 2 weeks later, I receive a certified letter from the Fairview Property Owners Association. Inside is a check for $600, a check for $2,000 for legal fees, and a letter signed by Roger. The letter says the HOA retracts the parking violation in writing, and it includes a fine waiver in writing with a firm no-contact directive. The letter also says Catherine Hall has resigned from her position as Special Assessment Coordinator, and the board has voted to remove her from all HOA committees. I take a photo of the letter and send it to David. He replies, "Congratulations, you won." I also get an email from Marcus with a link to the neighborhood group chat. Catherine's post from weeks ago, the one where she accused me of threatening her, has been removed and replaced with a correction. The correction says, "Previous post contained inaccurate information and has been removed per board directive." I screenshot it and add it to my folder. The folder now lives on my laptop as a reminder that bullies only win if you let them. The next day I go to the mailbox cluster at the front of the neighborhood, the unofficial courtroom where everyone gossips and trades stories. 3 neighbors I barely know walk over and congratulate me. One of them says, "We heard what you did. That took guts." Another says, "Catherine tried the same thing on my son last year, and we just paid the fine because we did not know we could fight it." I say, "You can always fight it. You just need proof." The third neighbor says, "The board is holding a special election next month to replace Catherine and Roger. You should run." I laugh and say, "I am not interested in running the HOA. I just want to live in peace." The neighbor says, "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, you have got my vote. I thank them and walk back to my house. My phone buzzes with a text from David. It says, the attorney letter forced the HOA to void the entire enforcement waive, and 3 other residents got refunds. You started something. I reply, good. He says, also, the state HOA regulatory board opened an investigation into the Fairview Property Owners Association. Catherine might face personal penalties. I say, even better. That evening, I sit on my porch with a beer and watch the sunset. The boot clamp scrape on my wheel is still there, but I am getting it fixed next week. The refinance went through and the lender apologized for the delay. Marcus walks over and says, I heard Catherine moved out, packed up and left yesterday. I say, where did she go? He says, no idea, and I do not care. He sits down on the steps and says, you know, this neighborhood is going to be a lot quieter without her. I say, that is the plan. He says, the election is in 3 weeks. I am running for the board. If I win, I am going to push for a full audit of the last 2 years. I want to see how much money Catherine skimmed off the fines. I say, let me know if you need help. He says, I will. He stands and says, thanks for not giving up. A lot of people would have just paid and moved on. I say, I am not a lot of people. He laughs and walks back to his house. The special election happens on a Saturday morning. I show up to vote, and the turnout is massive. The parking lot at the clubhouse is full, and there is a line out the door. I see faces I have never seen before. People who never came to meetings but showed up today because they heard what happened. Marcus is standing near the entrance, shaking hands and handing out flyers. I vote for him and 2 other candidates who promised to reform the enforcement process. The results are posted that evening. Marcus wins by a landslide. Roger loses his seat. The new board president is a retired teacher named Linda, who ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. I get a text from Marcus that says, we did it. The new board is voting to hire an independent auditor next week. I reply, congratulations. He says, this would not have happened without you. I say, you helped just as much. He says, let me buy you a beer sometime. I say, deal. The audit results come out 6 weeks later. The report is 30 pages long and it confirms what we suspected. Catherine imposed over $80,000 in fines over 18 months, and only half of those fines were legitimate. The rest were based on violations that never happened, hearings that never occurred, or rules that did not exist. The report recommends that the HOA refund all illegitimate fines and revise the enforcement process to include mandatory written notice and a formal appeals process. The new board votes unanimously to accept the recommendations. Within 2 months, 15 residents receive refund checks. 3 of them thank me personally. One of them says, I thought I was the only one. I did not know she was doing this to everyone. I say, you were not the only one. That is why it is important to speak up. Catherine never comes back. I hear through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to another city and tried to join an HOA board there, but someone looked her up online and found articles about the lawsuit. She did not get the position. Roger still lives in the neighborhood, but he keeps a low profile. I see him at the mailbox cluster sometimes, and he does not make eye contact. Marcus told me Roger tried to run for the board again a year later, but he lost by a huge margin. The neighborhood has not forgotten. As for me, I refinanced my house, fixed the wheel rim, and got back to my quiet life as a park ranger. I still see Marcus a few times a week and we have become good friends. He is on the board now and he keeps me updated on the reforms. The new parking enforcement process requires written notice, a 10-day cure period, and a formal hearing before any fine can be imposed. Towing and booting are only allowed in emergencies, and they require board approval. The neighborhood is calmer now. People are not afraid to park in their own driveways or have guests over. The mailbox cluster is still the unofficial courtroom, but now it is where people talk about weekend plans and neighborhood events, not about parking violations and fines. I kept all the evidence in a folder on my laptop, and I backed it up on 3 different drives. David told me to keep it for at least 7 years just in case. He said sometimes these things have a way of coming back. I also kept the fine waiver letter from the HOA. It is framed and hanging in my office as a reminder that standing up to bullies is worth it, even when it feels impossible. People ask me sometimes if I regret getting involved, if I wish I had just paid the $600 and moved on. I always say no. The $600 was never the point. The point was that Catherine thought she could do whatever she wanted because nobody had ever stopped her. She thought she could find me daily until I gave up and cried. She thought this was petty, and she thought this was her purpose. But I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. And in the end, her own words and actions buried her. The neighborhood is different now. The new board sends out monthly newsletters with clear updates on financials, upcoming projects, and any rule changes. They hold open meetings where residents can ask questions and voice concerns. The enforcement process is transparent, and the fines are reasonable. Nobody is afraid of the HOA anymore. It is what it should have been from the start. A group of neighbors working together to maintain the community, not a weapon used by one person to control everyone else. Marcus told me last month that membership in the HOA has actually gone up because people feel safe here now. He said, "You changed this place." I said, "We changed this place." He smiled and said, "Fair enough." I still drive past the gas station where Catherine cornered me, and every time I do, I remember the look on her face when I told her my lawyer would handle everything. She thought she had all the power, but power only works if people are too scared to fight back. I was not scared. I was angry, and I was stubborn, and I had the receipts. That combination is unbeatable. David told me after the hearing that he had handled dozens of HOA cases, but mine was one of the most satisfying because the evidence was so overwhelming. He said, "Most of the time, it is a he said, she said situation, and the HOA has the advantage because they control the records. But you documented everything, and you had allies who did the same. That made all the difference." I thanked him, and I meant it. I could not have done it without him, or Marcus, or the other residents who came forward. The lessons I learned from this fight are simple. First, document everything. Every email, every conversation, every notice, every interaction. If it is not documented, it did not happen. Second, find allies. You cannot fight an HOA alone, but you do not have to. There are always other people who have been hurt by the same abuse, and they will help if you ask. Third, stay calm. Bullies want you to lose your temper so they can use it against you. If you stay polite and professional, you force them to show their true colors, and that is when they lose. Fourth, know the rules better than they do. The HOA counts on residents not reading the bylaws or understanding their rights. If you read the bylaws and know the law, you can catch them in their own traps. And fifth, do not give up. The process is long, and it is frustrating, and it feels impossible sometimes. But if you keep pushing, if you keep building your case, you will win. Catherine thought she could bury me under fines and threats and bureaucracy. She thought I would give up, just like everyone else did. But she underestimated how much I value fairness and how far I am willing to go to protect it. I did not fight her because I wanted revenge. I fought her because what she was doing was wrong, and someone had to stop it. The fact that I got my money back and she lost her position was just a bonus. The real victory was knowing that the next person she tried to bully would not have to go through what I went through, because she was gone. I heard from one of the residents who got a refund that they used the money to take their kids on a vacation they had been putting off for years. Another resident used it to pay down credit card debt they had racked up trying to cover the fines. A third resident donated it to a local charity that helps people navigate HOA disputes. All of them said the same thing, that they felt like they had their power back. That is what this was really about. Not the money, not the parking spots, not even Catherine. It was about taking back the power that she had stolen from all of us. The neighborhood is quiet now, the kind of quiet I moved here for. I can sit on my porch and drink my coffee without worrying that someone is watching, waiting for me to make a mistake so they can find me. I can have friends over without worrying that their car will get towed. I can live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. That is what I fought for, and that is what I got. It was worth every hour I spent organizing documents, every dollar I spent on legal fees, and every sleepless night I spent worrying about whether I was doing the right thing. I was, and I would do it again. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.